The lighthouse at Sorrow Point had been dark for 37 years. Its lens cracked, its beacon extinguished, its keeper long dead. Yet, on nights when the fog rolled in thick as burial shrouds, fishermen swore they saw its light cutting through the mist, a sickly, pulsing glow that shouldn't exist. Thomas Hartley had heard the stories all his life. Growing up in the coastal town of Millhaven, he'd learned to dismiss them as sailors' tales, fueled by whiskey and isolation. But when his sister, Emma, vanished during a midnight sail, leaving only her empty boat drifting near the old lighthouse, Thomas could no longer ignore the whispers. The night was suffocating when Thomas approached Sorrow Point. The fog pressed against him like wet wool, muffling his footsteps on the rocky path. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a skeletal finger pointing at the starless sky. Its windows were black holes, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Yet as he climbed the spiral stairs, something flickered above, a light that shouldn't be there. The lamp room was empty save for the shattered Fresnel lens, its 1,000 fragments catching moonlight like broken teeth. Thomas ran his fingers along the cold brass fittings, feeling the grooves where countless hands had polished them smooth. Then the foghorn sounded impossible, as it had been removed decades ago. The light blazed to life, not the warm golden glow of a proper beacon, but something cold and wrong, like phosphorescence dredged from ocean depths. It pulsed with a rhythm that made Thomas's teeth ache, casting shadows that moved independent of their sources. Through the cracked lens, he saw the beam sweep across the water, and in its path, shapes began to emerge from the fog. Ships, dozens of them, their silhouettes wrong for this century. Sailing vessels with tattered canvas, steamers bleeding rust, fishing boats that had been reported lost for generations. They moved with unnatural precision, following the light like moths to flame, their decks empty of life, but somehow purposeful in their approach. Thomas pressed against the window, his breath fogging the glass. Among the ghost fleet, he spotted a familiar sail, his sister's sloop, the Emma's Dream, its hull pristine despite weeks at sea. But as it drew closer, he saw figures on deck, not Emma, but passengers who shouldn't exist, their faces pale as bone in the lighthouse glow. The keeper's log lay open on the lamp room floor, pages yellow with age, but the final entry fresh, as if written moments ago. They always come back. The light calls them home, but home isn't where they left it. Time flows differently in the dark between waves. What returns isn't what departed. Thomas heard footsteps on the stairs, many footsteps, too many, moving with the wet slap of waterlogged boots. The door creaked open, and the smell hit him. Brine and decay, old rope and older regrets. Emma stood in the doorway, seaweed tangled in her hair, her eyes reflecting the pulsing light. "We've been waiting," she said, her voice carrying the echo of deep places. "The lighthouse showed us the way back, but the toll must be paid for every soul that returns. Another must take their place in the fog. Behind her, more figures crowded the stairwell, sailors and passengers from across the decades, their clothing a patchwork timeline of maritime fashion. Their eyes held the same hollow light, the same patient hunger. Thomas understood then why the lighthouse had been abandoned, why the town had let it rot rather than restore it. The light pulsed faster now, and through the windows, Thomas saw more ships emerging from the fog. Not just from the past, but from futures that might have been. Timelines where the lighthouse never stopped burning, where the boundary between then and now dissolved like salt in water. Emma reached for him with fingers gone prunny from too long in the water. Choose, brother. Join us in the fleet, or take our place in the void between. The lighthouse must have its keeper, and the keeper must have his light. Thomas looked at the broken lens, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The light wasn't calling ships home, it was harvesting them, collecting souls across time to fuel its impossible glow. Each vessel that returned brought more than passengers. It brought the weight of unlived years, stories that ended mid-sentence, futures that would never unfold. He could feel the pull now, the way the light tugged at something behind his ribs. Around him, the ghostly crowd pressed closer, their collective breathing like tide against shingle. Emma's hand was almost touching his shoulder when Thomas made his choice. He grabbed the lighthouse lamp and hurled it through the window. The crash was tremendous, not just glass breaking, but something fundamental shattering. The light exploded outward in a nova of cold fire, and the fog itself seemed to scream. The ghost ships flickered like film frames jumping their sprockets, here one moment, transparent the next. Emma's face contorted in anguish as she began to fade. "You don't understand," she whispered as she dissolved. "We were the lucky ones. We got to come back. The others are still out there, waiting in the dark, calling for a light that will never come." The lighthouse groaned around him, its stones grinding against each other like massive teeth. The surviving ships were being pulled back into the fog, their outlines blurring, their stolen time unraveling. Thomas ran for the stairs as the structure began to collapse, each step crumbling seconds after his feet left them. He burst from the door just as the lighthouse folded in on itself, stones tumbling seaward in an avalanche of history. The fog retreated with it, pulling back like a living thing in pain, revealing a dawn that seemed too bright, too real after the nightmare of the night. Where the lighthouse had stood, only rubble remained, but in the early morning light, Thomas could see them, shadows on the water where no shadows should fall, the suggestions of sails and smokestacks that appeared only in peripheral vision. The ghost fleet was still there, just beyond the edge of seeing, waiting for another beacon to guide them home. Thomas never spoke of what happened that night. He moved inland, far from any coast, but on foggy evenings, he sometimes saw lights in his window that shouldn't exist, lighthouse beams sweeping across landlocked streets, searching for souls to harvest, and sometimes, just before dawn, he heard his sister's voice carried on impossible tides. The darkness between waves is patient, brother. It remembers those who refuse its gifts. The town of Millhaven eventually forgot about the lighthouse at Sorrow Point. New residents assumed the rubble had always been there, a natural formation carved by wind and wave. But the old fishermen still avoided those waters on foggy nights, and mothers still warned their children never to follow lights that burned where no fire should be, for in the space between what was and what might have been, the lighthouse still stands, its keeper still climbing endless stairs, its light still calling to ships that sail in the gaps between seconds. And on the darkest nights, when the fog rolls in thick enough to muffle sound and smother thought, you can still see it, a cold glow on the horizon, patient as death, bright as the lies we tell ourselves about what waits in the dark.